Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening to everybody, or good morning to you, Federico, once again, because you are in Argentina, and to everybody else who is in a different part of the world, hello. Thank you for joining us. And today, once again, we have Dr. Nagy, Stephen Nagy, whom you already know from our previous rooms. And tonight, we're going to talk about the Biden administration post-midterms and the Indo-Pacific. So it's a very hot topic, I believe. This one and the next one are going to be also, the next one is going to be also a very hot one. As you know, Stephen is going to do the briefing, and then we'll open the room for questions and answers, comments, and discussion in general. So please feel free to join us. And without any further ado, Stephen, let's start.
Hi, Maya. Thanks very much. And hello, everybody. It's great to be back. I hope it's a real tragedy to be holding this podcast or this clubhouse after the tragic events in Seoul, but also in India today. Just reminds us that the world has many, many challenges, and some of them come upon us, leading to really, it's a shock to learn about those incidents. So our thoughts and prayers to the people of Korea, but also the people of India that have lost family members. I think it's a real shock. Today we want to talk a little bit about the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and what we may or may not expect from the upcoming midterm elections and how they could impact the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. And in this particular context, I think there's a couple ways for us to be thinking about it. It's basically formulas of who wins the House and who wins the Senate. I think the first formula is that the Democrats lose the Senate and the House to the Republicans, and this has, I think, implications not only for the Indo-Pacific strategy, but potentially for the United States and how they're engaging in the Ukraine. The second scenario is a split, where let's say the Democrats hang on to the Senate and the Republicans hang on to the House, or flip the House. The third is a reversal of that. And then the fourth, which is, I think, highly unlikely, is the Democrats hold on to both the Senate and the House the House. So those four scenarios are really interesting for us to be thinking about where the United States is going in terms of its Indo-Pacific strategy, but also where it's going in terms of the Ukraine. So let's start with the most optimistic scenario. That's the Democrats hold the House and the Senate. In this particular case, I think we'll see a lot more continuity in Indo-Pacific policy, and that Indo-Pacific policy will be characterized by a systemic alliance-first approach to engagement in the region, seeing the broader region through the Indo-Pacific lens and putting China within that context. That would likely mean a continuation of infrastructure-related initiatives, the CHIP Act, controlling semiconductor flows in and out of China and the region, most likely bringing some of the semiconductor supplies, chain production back to the United States and like-minded countries, or so-called friendshoring. This is not the likely scenario, though, but it is important for us to consider because it would be very much a demonstration that the Biden administration is broadly supported in its policies here and abroad. It would also likely mean a continuation of the United States' firm engagement with regards to the Ukraine. And I think this is really, really important because the United States sees resistance of Russia in the Ukraine as an important part of really thinking about the resistance that is going to be necessary to deal with a revisionist China in this particular region. The second scenario that I think is perhaps less likely is that the Republicans take both the House and the Senate. Now here, this is quite interesting, and in the past we've seen when and this is during the Clinton administration, when the Republicans took both the House and the Senate, it pushed President Clinton back to the center and to take on more securitarized approaches and a more free trade approach to thinking about trade in the region. So in this context, if the Republicans take both the House and the Senate, they're likely to be more inclined towards the former President of the United States' inclinations about alliances, about overseas involvement, about trade. And what that means for the Indo-Pacific is it means that the United States is a much more transactional approach to how it deals with allies within the region. And that means demanding more from Japan, South Korea, perhaps Australia, a more transactional approach to trade agreements, and that could mean pressure on Japan and South Korea to reset or recalibrate their trade agreements. It would also likely mean some kind of shift on the Ukraine position to concentrate on the economy at home and to engage in a more pro-containment strategy vis-a-vis China. And this also means targeting the party, which is something that I think the Biden administration hasn't done. Another scenario, and I think the third scenario, which is probably the most likely, is that the Democrats hold on to the Senate, but they lose the House. And in this particular case, it means that the Republicans will have more ability to shape defense expenditures and shaping the different committees that are involved in shaping Indo-Pacific engagement. And what we see on the Republican side is that they have a much harder line with regards to China. Their approaches would be, I guess, articulated as a more pro-containment side, clearly vilifying the Chinese Communist Party of China, and clearly working with allies for an overt containment strategy. Now, does this mean the Biden administration would adopt this kind of strategy? Not necessarily, but it certainly would push the Biden administration to a more securitarized and that approach to how it engages in the Indo-Pacific, but also how it engages in China. And that means more vigorous competition with China. It means more potential for something like a Taiwanese contingency to occur. And what I mean by that is further escalation of the United States' position and relationship vis-a-vis Taiwan, and that could potentially be a tripwire for a conflict with China. We're also likely to see a retrenchment in aid towards Ukraine. Thinking about the priorities from the Republican side is the domestic economy. Not that the Biden administration's priority is not the domestic economy, but the Republicans have campaigned hard on America First, making America great again, and by adopting the former President of the United States line of America First. And this will create challenges in terms of competing with Russia and pushing back against Russia's aggression vis-a-vis the Ukraine. But I think it's also important for us to be thinking about the impact of the Senate, of the Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee and others, and shaping dialogue in general on foreign policy vis-a-vis the Ukraine, but also vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. Lastly, and I think the perhaps likely scenario is that these Republicans take the Senate and the Democrats somehow keep hold of the House of Representatives. So in this particular case, it means that the Senate has some oversight over U.S. foreign policy and over the president's initiatives, and this again means that there's potential opportunity for the Republicans to shape the president's agenda, or for the president to take an approach that he can't really do in the present circumstance because of roadblocks within the Democratic Party. And what I mean is that the so-called progressives within the party resist a harder line against the Chinese and more involvement in overseas. And in this particular case, that Republican Senate may push Biden or give him the ability to do what he would actually like to do vis-a-vis the region, is that invest many more resources within the region, allocate budgets so that the United States can take a much more forward-leaning position within the region, and as a result have a more committed and resourced approach to the Indo-Pacific region. So out of those four scenarios, I think it's important for us to be looking again of which party wins the Senate, which wins the House of Representatives, but what kinds of who sits as chair people or chairwoman and chairmen on various committees, and how is this reflected in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy, whether the United States turns more inward in terms of making America great or America first or building back better, or if it maintains a pretty good balance in terms of its foreign engagement and domestic policies. All scenarios are a possibility, but again, I think that the most likely scenario is that the Republicans take the House, the Democrats keep the Senate, and that the Republican House pulls President Biden towards the right of center on foreign policy in terms of the Indo-Pacific and dealing with China in the Indo-Pacific, and pulls or perhaps makes it more difficult for Biden to they may try to push Biden towards some kind of compromise with regards to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So that is just a few brief thoughts. I welcome all your ideas and conversation, and I'd like to hear more from all of you.
Thank you, Stephen. And I wonder, you mentioned that if the Republicans if they take both the House and the Senate, so the pressure on the countries here in the Indo-Pacific region will increase. And I wonder how is this scenario viewed, or even the different scenarios, how are they viewed from the countries here in this region? Because we know how the United States will probably, or how the politicians there will probably act towards the Indo-Pacific, but how do you think the countries here see these scenarios?
Well, I think a country like Japan or South Korea, they're a one-song band, and what I mean by that is that they have one alliance partner, and that's the United States, and they have to hug. And when it's a president that's not necessarily orthodox in the sense that they understand orthodox presidencies, they hug that president tighter. And we saw this with the Japanese and the Koreans during the time of the former president of the United States, where they tried to insulate the broader relationship from the leadership by building the best possible leader-to-leader relationship, but also sending emissaries and building the strongest relationship possible at the military-to-military relationship, politician-to-politician relationship, business-to-business relationship, think-tank-to-think tank relationship. And what we saw during that period is a much more robust presence of these countries within Washington to try and shape and protect the relationships that exist outside the presidency. I assume that will be a similar case if it's a Republican administration, or a Republican House and a Republican Senate. There are certain concerns about whether those Republicans will, be wedded to many of the positions that they've taken that resonate with or reflect the former occupant of the White House's positions on foreign policy. And if that is the particular case, then they have to build strong ties to try and lobby and shape the views of those politicians. The reality is also that if the Republicans win both the House and the Senate, that the 2024 election would likely see at least a Mr. Trump running for presidency or a Trump-like figure running for the presidency. And Trump-like figure, there's a continuum of what I mean there. It could be somebody that spouts the rhetoric but has a more centrist position on many issues, or it could be someone very much in the mold of the previous occupant of the White House. And I think that raises really a lot of concerns for Seoul, Tokyo, Canberra, Singapore, and others as how they will manage their relationship with the United States while at the same time deal with some of the challenges that they face vis-a-vis China, their biggest trading partner.
Yes, that's interesting. And you mentioned Japan, South Korea. How about the other countries here? Or maybe we can ask Lynn, since she's here, maybe how her country's government sees those scenarios. Lynn, hello.
Yes, so thank you, Maya. Good evening, Professor Stephen. Um, I have a question about one of your essays that suggested U.S. rethink of its approach to a flexible and inclusive Indo-Pacific. So in your essay, you recommended key tools for the U.S. to anchor itself into the region, including expanding its participation in the Quad and expanding the number of AUKUS partners. However, you know that from the Chinese perspective and countries having close relationship with China, like many in Southeast Asia, these multilateral partnerships are often viewed as containing or blockading China. So my question is, do you think that the inclusion of more countries in this kind of arrangement could just amplify China's security concerns and skepticism about the U.S. intention, and it also reinforced China's impression that the U.S. is standing behind all of the efforts to deteriorate China's political system, which I think was also reflected in the political report of the recent China Party Congress. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lynn. So the question revolves around, an essay I think I wrote in the Nikkei on the United States rethinking its Indo-Pacific economic framework or its Indo-Pacific engagement. And basically, I said that if the U.S. has a securitized approach to the Indo-Pacific, that it's not going to get the stakeholders it needs to, win the hearts and minds of the region and be able to shape the region in a way that suits the United States, but also regional stakeholders. So I think that post-election, that if the Republicans do very, very well, we are likely to see a more securitized approach, and this will create more challenges for the stakeholders within the region. As the Prime Minister of Singapore has written in Foreign Affairs and spoken many times, is that Southeast Asian countries don't want to choose between China and the United States. Quietly, they want much more of the United States within the region. They want to anchor the United States in the region, both from security, diplomatic, and economic front. But they can't really say that openly. But at the same time, they want to maintain that relationship with China. Now, as to a post-midterms scenario where countries plug into the Quad or AUKUS, etc., I think this is the natural trajectory of where these relationships are going, and that it will, if they do it or they don't do it, that Beijing will call these cliques, they'll call them alliances, they'll call them manipulated by hegemonic United States to keep China down. So whether that's true or not, I think is less important than the reality is that it doesn't matter how the United States engages in the region post-election, is that China will see all initiatives, all actions through the lens of alliances, cliques, and an attempt to contain China or stop China's development. And this is something that I think they are very much wedded to intellectually and ideologically, and I don't think it really matters in terms of the electoral results from the Chinese point of view, because they have come to the conclusion that the United States is very much about trying to contain China's rise. So, I think in this sense, whether it's the Quad or AUKUS or other events, it doesn't really matter from the Chinese from the perspective of the partners within the region, because I think China will take a similar perspective no matter if other members join or if they don't.
Yes, Professor. So I think that it's very difficult for countries to cooperate with China if we consistently send the wrong signal to China. And actually, in the political report of the 20th China Party Congress, it also mentioned, as I remember, 90 times of the word security. I mean, nearly doubling that of the previous report of the 19th Party Congress. So it means that China really feels insecure. And I think that maybe many of you might think that China is not good at understanding the feeling of other countries. But from my point of view, other countries might not be really understand the feeling of China. So here I find that it's very difficult to cooperate with China if we continuously like sending the wrong signal, like having the impression a lot of articles that like going against China?
Well, I won't disagree with you. I think that great power autism, and that's, it's a term that was coined by Edward Ludwig, talked about this idea that great powers, or these big countries like China or the United States or Russia, are not very good or attuned to understanding how smaller countries feel. And as a result, they make decisions and they make calculations that are less analytical or less nuanced than they could be. Whereas smaller countries or mid-sized countries, they always have to think very carefully of how they engage in their relationships with bigger countries, because they have a much more to lose. And you're from Vietnam, so you understand that your Vietnamese, the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, is visiting Xi, or visited Xi this week, and to express solidarity and congratulate him, and to demonstrate that the relationship is comprehensive and that the South China Sea issues that are complicating the bilateral relations shouldn't be the core to the relationship. So in a sense, I think you're very, very right that we need to have a more nuanced approach, but China also needs to have a more nuanced approach. And I think probably China's in a more difficult position because of the ideological trajectory it has taken. The new Politburo Standing Committee is completely, I think most analysts see it as an ideological team rather than a team of technocrats, although I do think they have technocratic ability, that represent Xi's wishes and that they are yes men. So this will be difficult for China moving forward to start reading how other countries are thinking when the people surrounding Xi are not able to speak frankly for fear of prosecution of some kind. So it's something that we need to watch, but countries need to have more literacy about China.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. Stephen, there are quite a few comments and questions in the room chat, so I'll start with the first one. The first one is from Hiroaki, and it reads, "Isn't Reagan approach effective and doable vis-a-vis autocratic competitors?"
So I think that the Reagan approach was to contain China, to outcompete Russia or Soviet Union. And is that realistic? And I think probably not, for a couple of reasons. First, that the level of economic integration between the Soviet Union and the so-called West, led by the United States during the Cold War, was very, very, very low, meaning that the competition between the two states didn't affect their economic relationship. Where China and the Western countries, including the United States, the trade relationship is very, very significant. I think last year the United States traded 600 billion of goods with China, and Japan traded about 230, and I can't remember the figures for Korea and Australia and other countries. China is well integrated into our economies, which make conflict and containing China. And what I mean by containing, and this will speak to Janice's question, what is containment, is stopping its rise by cutting its economy off from the outside world, from cutting off its diplomatic relations, cutting off its access to technology. I think that is much more difficult within the Chinese context because of the size of the economy, because of where the global production network is centered, and because of the comparative advantages that China has in terms of human capital, the numbers of human capital, and the reality of the logistics that have been built for 40 years, which make China really irreplaceable for low and mid-level production of goods for global export.
Yes. Hiroki, I hope this answers your first question. Then the next one, maybe we can keep it for a little bit later, and then going forward. Is a bipartisanship between good Democrats and good Republicans possible again for the U.S. midterm election?
So I think the answer is yes, and I'll say that for a couple reasons. First, I think that the nature or the recognition of the challenge that China represents for the United States and for the Western world is broadly recognized within both parties. We saw that the Biden administration, although has taken a very different tone in terms of rhetoric and in terms of being a much more systematic and strategic competitor of China, that it has continued with the hard line against China. And this represents that bipartisan agreement that that China is a challenge that the United States needs to face. And we see much more continuity in the policies that were put forward under the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And this should not be a surprise, right? It wasn't Mr. Trump that made these policies. It was his national security advisors, whether it was General Mattis or the others, that were deeply steeped in national security issues. Even Matt Pottinger, who was just in town last week, talking to Professor Suzuki at Tokyo University at the International House, was talking about the deep relationship between Japan and the United States that goes beyond parties, goes beyond administrations. So, Hiroaki, I think that we will still see more continuity and more cohesion on China policy and Indo-Pacific policy post midterms. Where I think might see a shift is how securitarized these policies will be. And I don't think a country like Japan or South Korea would like to see as a very, very securitarized approach, but they would like to see, a trade pillar. They'd like to see much more diplomatic agreement or engagement within the region. They'd like to see, more deterrence capabilities put in the region. That is the approach that they're thinking, and that's how they're. I think how we can understand more unity on the China front rather than less going forward.
Right. Thank you for that response. And then the next one. Okay, so do you have any information of a meeting between Secretary Blinken and the Foreign Minister of China, Wang? If you have that information, I mean, positive or negative.
So Hiroaki, at this stage, I don't have any special information about a potential meeting. I think the Chinese now, after the 20th Party Congress, has made a decision, and they've made a decision about their leadership and the direction that they'd like to take their country moving forward. And what they're doing is waiting for the results of the midterms of the United States to get a sense if the Biden administration will be stronger or weaker. I think that their view is probably that the Biden administration will be in a weaker position post-election, and that it will open up space for them to have a conversation in which they try to establish regular communication. In my understanding, I think that the Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Anthony Blinken are trying to set up the conditions for meet at the G20 in Indonesia in November, so next month, which is only 2 weeks away. And they're hoping that this will be the beginning of some kind of regular dialogue at the leadership level, talking about bilateral relations. But I think that whether this can happen or not is less important than whether it will be sustainable or not. And at this particular stage, I don't think the dialogue is sustainable because of domestic issues in the Chinese context.
That's interesting, and thank you, Stephen. And definitely this is good news. I mean that probably there is a movement towards establishing a dialogue again, because it looks to me like, well, the dialogue actually disappeared with the administration of President Biden. Because before that, even though it was kind of scarce and patchy, there was still some dialogue between the United States and China, probably the United States and Russia as well. And it strikes me, and not only me, when I talk with friends and colleagues, people are noticing that there is very little communication between the great powers nowadays.
I definitely wouldn't put this at the at the hands of the Biden administration. I think the reality is that the communication started to get cut off when the COVID pandemic started, and under the Trump administration, there was some certain expressions that were used, and we saw politicization of the virus, and this created a circumstance where the communication has basically stopped. Now, since the Biden administration came into power, I think the Chinese were hoping for a reset. They thought that he would take a different view than the Trump administration. But in fact, he's continued with much of the policy because the general direction was the right policy. Of course, all the details were problematic. And once the Chinese realized this, then that plus the pandemic has created really a vacuum. And what we consistently see is the Americans reaching out and other countries reaching out, but the Chinese counterparts basically saying that if you don't change the tone of how we discuss things, that we won't be able to cooperate and engage in dialogue with you. Now, historically, that has been the pattern, is when there is a problem between China and another country, they just cut off communication. And this is a strategy to try and push the counterparts to the negotiating table by diluting their initial position. And it works. It works often. The question is whether the Biden administration will soften its position, which I think is the correct position moving forward. And when it does soften that position, will it open up an opportunity for China and the United States to communicate? And I think they can, but I'm not sure the Chinese are willing to really talk.
Right. Well, we'll see what happens. And then along these lines, probably the answer is no, but still your opinion I would like to hear. So is there any possibility of cooperation between the US and China on stopping the war in Ukraine? Maybe not at this point of time, but in the near future?
Well, this is a little bit disconnected from the theme of the midterm elections and the Indo-Pacific footprint of the United States. But I think there's a couple scenarios where I think the Chinese and the Americans may potentially find an opportunity to communicate, to cooperate. And one is if the Russians decide to use a dirty bomb in Ukraine, I think, or a non-dirty bomb in Ukraine. And if this happens, I think that it would be very difficult for China to maintain its position vis-a-vis Russia, because it would demonstrate a clear act of aggression against a sovereign state, which goes against China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. It would be untenable in supporting a nuclear attack against the Ukraine. And this could be an opportunity for the Americans and the Chinese to come together in terms of trying to put pressure on Russia. Whether the Chinese are going to be able to do this, at this stage, I don't think they're there. I think they are hoping that the very cold winter that's coming for much of the world will soften countries' positions on the Ukraine. And as they soften their positions on the Ukraine, that they will pressure their governments to find or pressure the Ukraine and Russia to come to the table and come to an uncomfortable compromise, which would likely mean that the Russians keep territory and the Ukrainians lose territory, and the Russians would not pay any war reparations for the invasion of Ukraine. It's not a happy scenario, but that is a potential. That's a possibility, and I think that's how the Russians are thinking about their strategy moving forward. That is not a positive for the Chinese. I think if Russia comes out of this in a much weaker position, it will mean that they've lost a partner that they can work with and that is useful for balancing the United States and the West. If the Russians do keep the territory, it'll push the Chinese to take a position that it goes against or against their own 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So they're in a difficult situation, and I think the only way that they'll change tack on Russia is if Russia crosses the nuclear red line. And in that particular position, the Chinese will make a calculation of what can they get for supporting the U.S. and Western position on Russia, while getting some compromise on trade and technology flows coming into China.
Well, Hiroki, I hope that this answered your question, the other one. And then, okay, so we move to the next one. So I still wonder about the point, how can we influence China without an inclusive and cooperative approach to them?
And so in general, I think that the cooperation that we're trying to get from China is very much dictated on the domestic politics within China, the trajectory of the economy, and how secure the party feels vis-a-vis the United States, and the growing pressures that they're feeling as the United States and other countries start to build a coalition to pressure China and to shape its behavior. This is really, really, really difficult, because we don't know what is their breaking point? And I don't mean breaking in terms of collapse. I mean, when will they take a different position? And I think that in general, they'll only take a different position at the point where they feel that their regime is secure and the United States is no longer involved in activities that they understand is attempting regime change. I think that cooperation also might be able to be elicited if there is some face-losing exercises that are applied to working with China. And what I mean by that is that we start to talk more about how China's one-dimensional approach to diplomacy is coming at the expense of the global South. And what I mean by that is that I think China is the number one producer of emissions right now, and the United States is number two. And that without both of these countries reducing their emissions and finding a way to cooperate on climate change, really, it's not going to have an positive. Any other policies taken, it's not going to have a positive impact on climate change. So the United States and others may want to highlight that when they're talking to the global South, that China has taken an approach. It's one-dimensional in terms of how they think about cooperation, how they think about dialogue, and that their choices are going to have negative consequences on the global South in terms of environmental catastrophe.
Okay, and so probably we can move back to one of the previous questions about Mr. Kishida and the G20 meeting in Hiroshima. So how can Prime Minister Kishida manage the elements of inclusion and division for the next G20 summit in Hiroshima? So if you have any recommendations or even suggestions, I don't know whether it is an easy question or not for you. Probably it isn't, but
so it's a bit outside the theme of today's discussion, but I'll give you some views. I think going forward that Russia will be alienated until it changes its behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine. This is, I think, not going to change because what Vladimir Putin did was use violence to try and shape the regional order in Eastern Europe. That hasn't happened in this part of the world in terms of China and Taiwan, or China and South China Sea, or East China Sea, or even the Himalayan plateau to a certain degree. And that means that it would be very difficult for Mr. Kishida to exclude China from the G7 or for the G20. But Russia, on the other hand, I think it's probably not too hard to stop them from participating in these events for the simple fact that, as I mentioned, that they have engaged against or invaded another state. And this invasion has disrupted food security, energy security, and of course the lives of ordinary Ukrainians. And I assume that they would not be welcome to the G20 summit in Hiroshima.
Interesting. I believe that depending on which part of the world you are in, probably the views on this are different. And the only thing that really bothers me is that, not only me actually, is that by refusing participation on whatever ground, actually, that's another way, of not having a dialogue. And we know that when, opposing sides don't talk, worse things can happen. So,
I would agree, but from the Chinese perspective, that this technique has served them well, right? During the Qing dynasty, they kept foreigners out, and that served their stability for almost 300 years, until it no longer was tenable. So I think that this is something they're comfortable with. I think that in terms of the domestic contradictions in the Chinese economy moving forward, that they're going to have to find ways to insulate themselves from outside influences, so that they can really put the Marxist-Leninist stamp of control on society. This, having open borders with countries that think very differently is quite a challenge.
indeed. And Gabor, thank you for your comment. If you can join us up on stage, please do. I'll read the comment out anyway. So the other question is how long China wants to stay in the cooperation without sealing with Russia. When the relationship is getting more toxic, and especially if Russia seems to be losing the war, does China want to stick together and support the loser? Yes, that's an interesting comment too.
So, Gabor, I think that on the large-scale issues, Russia and China still remain very much aligned in terms of weakening international law, weakening the definition of democracy, human rights, decreasing the influence that the United States and like-minded countries have on international institutions, on global culture, on values, on entertainment, all of these areas that they see as important power for the United States to shape global communities, global governance, and the values of many, many, many countries. Now, I think why they're aligned is because both of these countries are revisionist states. They don't believe in the current U.S.-led international order, even though it's an imperfect one. Their governments depend on the definition of democracy and human rights and development and rule of law to be very arbitrary, so that they can shape and keep their political systems intact. And this, I think, creates comradeship from the Russian and the Chinese perspective, and their broad interests, but they still have issues along their border. And if you've ever been to Beijing, you'll often hear from Chinese scholars that most of Eastern Russia was part of China. So that means Vladivostok up to the Kamchatka Peninsula, etc., etc., etc. And the Russians have real fears about this. Whether that the Chinese claims are correct or not, that's a different story. And whether the Russian fears are substantial or not, that's a different story. But they have these concerns. Russia's also worried about China making inroads into Russia's traditional sphere of influence in the stands. And I think this is also an area that of some concern. And lastly, I'm not so sure if Putin's Russia is comfortable with China leading development moving forward. And I'm not a Russian specialist, but that's my general inclination.
Oh, thank you for the view. All right, the Russian fears are valid considering the population of the Russian Far East. Right, that's from Gabor again. And thank you, Stephen, from him once again. Great.
My pleasure, Gabor. It's a really good question. We'll have to watch, I think, as the what's going to happen with the conflict in Ukraine. It's been 9 months. In February and March, we'll have a better sense of where Europe is in terms of dealing with some of their energy issues. We'll have a better sense of where Russia is in terms of managing the partial mobilization of its citizens. We'll have a better sense of where the United States is, and if it's able to continue to coordinate the position in the region. So there's a lot on the table to watch, and there's also the potential for another black swan that could swing things in a different direction. So a lot a lot to watch.
So from Gabor, he wrote, so their alignment is a lot broader than just the Ukraine war.
So actually, I don't think they're aligned in the Ukraine war, Gabor. I think that the Chinese thought that it would be a quick 3-day victory, and that's it. And it's turned out to be completely different than what they expected. And this has implications for how they've also they've organized their own military, because much of the Chinese military organization took place during the Soviet period, and they adopted a lot of the Soviet techniques. And it says a lot about the inability of those systems to compete with the United States and allies. But I think they've also seen the comprehensive power, such as financial sanctions, economic sanctions, diplomatic, etc., in putting pain on Russia. So I think that they're definitely not aligned on the Ukraine right now. I don't think they ever were, but they're definitely aligned on weakening international institutions like the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization, so that they are less rule of law focused, so that they can be used to secure the interests of these two states, rather than as these institutes were initially conceived to really create the conditions where peace is fostered through a commitment to liberal institutionalism.
Thank you for the explanation. Well, Gabor, I hope that this helps you also clarify for yourself how Russia and China are aligned on different issues. So, Stephen, thank you so very much. It looks like we have more or less gone through the questions. Well, with this, if you're fine, we can wrap up the room and get ready for the night. Of course, we'll be here once again in 2 weeks. And then we'll be talking about the 20th Party Congress in China. So to everybody who is here, please join us on, November the 13th. So when we'll be here once again at 8 o'clock in the evening. And please get ready with the questions and comments once again. So Stephen, well, let's conclude here. What a few words you have to say?
All right. So again, I think about those 4 scenarios. They're useful tools to understand how the changing balance of power within the United States is going to impact not only the Indo-Pacific region, but also the conflict in Ukraine. I think it's important to look at who will be the chairs of different committees that will shape budget procurement, foreign policy research, and that this will be really important. And I think that the biggest change that we could probably hope for is that the Republicans will take the House, and when they do that, it'll probably push President Biden to the right, which is not necessarily a bad thing for engagement within this region. Lastly, and again, please join me in terms of some thoughts and prayers for those families and for the people of Korea, but also of India, who have lost many loved ones over the past couple days. I think that we should always not only think about these serious issues such as the Indo-Pacific, but also have some empathy for some of the tragedies that are happening within the region as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much. And well, to everybody who is in Japan, have a good night. And to everybody else who is in other part of the world, have a great day. Thank you very much. See you again, and bye. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.